Welcome to Bedtime, Sleepy Historian. A place where the past drifts quietly back to life. Here, history isn't told with shouting battles or noisy timelines. It is whispered, like the sea against an old harbor wall, or the wind across abandoned fields. We wander through the stories often left behind. The forgotten ships that sank beneath medieval waves. The silent aftermath of plagues. The legends of ghostly kings. And the strange superstitions that guided everyday lives. These are not loud histories. They are soft echoes, meant to calm the mind, to slow the breath, and perhaps to keep you company as sleep arrives. So if you wish to drift through time at a gentler pace, to hear the hidden, haunting, and human side of the past, settle in. You have found your harbor. You have found your historian. And the night's story is about to begin. The gathering of ships. It began with sails, white as gull wings, rising along the horizon. One after another, the masts bristled in the harbors of northern France, where carpenters had hammered day and night to prepare a fleet vast enough to darken the Channel waters. Chroniclers would later say 30,000 men gathered beneath those banners, though numbers have a way of swelling with fear and memory. What mattered was the sight: decks crowded with soldiers, wagons loaded with provisions, horses stamping uneasily in their stalls below, and priests walking the length of the piers, blessing each keel with trembling hands. The king had ordered this armada to carry his war across the sea. The enemy waited on distant shores, yet the mood among the men was buoyant. They drank from leather flasks, slapped one another on the back, and gazed at the endless forest of sails with awe. Few had ever seen such a thing, a navy that seemed to scrape against the clouds. Yet on the edges of the harbor, old fishermen muttered into their beards. They watched the ropes being coiled and the anchors weighed with uneasy silence. For they knew the sea as a living thing, and living things have tempers. Armies may be commanded, but the tide answers to no king. When the last ship slid free of its moorings, cheers rolled like thunder down the coast. Mothers wept, wives waved scraps of cloth, and children ran barefoot in the surf until the water lifted them from their feet. Then the fleet turned, sails swelling with the first push of wind, and moved toward the horizon in one vast migration of wood and canvas. No one on shore could know it, but it was the last time they would see their fathers, brothers, and sons. The sea opens. The first day was gentle. A mild wind carried the armada westward, the water lapping at their hulls as though rocking children to sleep. Men sang on the decks, their voices clumsy but full of cheer. The priests moved among them with their psalters, offering blessings against seasickness and storm, though few felt the need. The sky was pale blue, stretched wide and empty, promising nothing but fair weather. But by evening, as the sun lowered itself behind a bank of clouds, the horizon changed its face. A smudge of darkness appeared, barely visible at first, as though a candle had been extinguished at the world's edge. The older sailors stiffened. They whispered to one another, hands tightening on the ropes, eyes fixed on the bruise spreading across the heavens. The men-at-arms laughed at their worry. What did soldiers care for clouds? They clanged their helmets together, and told one another tales of what they would do when they reached the enemy's coast. Some spoke of plunder, others of honor. A few, quieter than the rest, confessed to longing only for survival. By nightfall the sea had grown restless. Waves slapped against the planks like impatient fists. The fleet, so majestic by day, became a confusion of silhouettes under the pale glow of a rising moon. The wind no longer caressed the sails, it seized them, pulling and snapping until the canvas groaned like wounded beasts. From ship to ship, lanterns swung on the masts, signaling orders. Captains shouted, trying to keep the vessels in formation. But the sea was already answering in its own tongue, the creak of timber, the thud of barrels rolling loose, the first shouts of men losing their footing. A priest clutched the mast and raised his voice against the rising gale. "Lord, command the waters and let them obey!" His words were whipped away before the men could hear them. The night swallowed the sound of laughter. All that remained was the pounding of waves, louder with each passing hour. The storm breaks. The storm did not announce itself with a crack of thunder or a blaze of lightning. It crept in, patient and deliberate, until the men realized they were no longer sailing but fighting. The first mast splintered before midnight. A scream tore across the fleet as the tall spar toppled into the sea, crushing men beneath its weight. Sparks flared when iron fittings struck against wood, a brief flash of fire before being smothered by the waves. The sound carried, chilling every ear, though most could not see which ship had suffered the blow. Winds rose with the speed of panic. They whipped across the decks, tearing men from their posts, flinging cloaks and helmets into the blackness. Canvas sails strained and then burst, unraveling like wounded flesh. Orders could no longer be heard. Voices were drowned by the roar of the sea. Captains bellowed until their throats bled, but their words dissolved into the storm's chorus. Rain came next. Heavy, blinding, it fell in sheets that blurred the world into chaos. Men clung to rigging, their eyes stinging, their hands numb. The water on the decks grew deep enough to slosh against their boots. Some began to bail with buckets, others with their bare hands, though all knew it was futile. A knight, armored still as though the sea would respect his station, stumbled and fell across the planks. He tried to rise, but the weight of his mail pulled him down. A sailor reached out, fingers brushing against the knight's gauntlet, but the next wave surged between them. The knight was gone, swallowed into the black, a splash quickly lost in countless others. "Cut the lines!" someone screamed. Ropes were severed with axes, sending sails flying loose into the night. But without their sails, the ships became helpless, tossed like toys. Lightning finally split the sky. For a heartbeat the fleet was illuminated, row after row of ships heaving and groaning, men bent like ants beneath an uncaring storm. Then darkness returned, thicker than before, leaving behind the echo of that brief glimpse of doom. Somewhere to starboard, a horn blew a note of distress. It faltered, broke, and was not heard again. The sea had claimed its first victims, and the night was far from over. Scattered into darkness. By dawn, if dawn could even be named beneath the shroud of clouds, the fleet no longer resembled an army. What had left port as a disciplined line of ships, sails snapping in unison, was now a scattering of broken shadows across the sea. Each vessel fought alone, its fate no longer tied to the grand vision of kings and generals but to the stubbornness of wood and rope, the trembling grip of sailors who had not slept, and the mercies of the storm. On the flagship, the admiral himself clung to the rail, his face pale with salt and exhaustion. The banner that once flew proudly from the stern, a crest woven with gold thread, was gone, ripped away during the night. The ship's timbers groaned with every swell, and the admiral's prayers were drowned by the endless roar. He had commanded battles before, but here, strategy was useless. The sea did not heed tactics. Elsewhere, a galley laden with soldiers had broken an oar bank, leaving half its rowers powerless. The remaining men pulled with desperation, their backs slick with sweat despite the cold, but the imbalance dragged the ship sideways into the waves. When the next wall of water rose, taller than a tower, the vessel rolled onto its flank. Men screamed as they were swept into the sea, their helmets vanishing like stones. The ship did not rise again. Another vessel, a merchant hulk pressed into military service, fared no better. Its cargo hold filled with water until the timbers split apart. Bales of wool, barrels of salted fish, and crates of weapons spilled into the froth, tumbling alongside drowning men. Survivors clung to floating planks, calling for help that never came. The sea was wide, and no captain could see another's lantern through the rain. Signals, once carefully arranged, were lost. The blast of a horn meant nothing now, only another desperate cry fading into emptiness. By mid-morning, what remained of the fleet was scattered across leagues of storm. Some ships limped forward, stripped of rigging. Others turned in circles, rudders snapped. Many were gone altogether, vanished as though they had never existed. Yet the storm did not relent. The sky pressed down like an iron lid, sealing them into this watery tomb. Each sailor understood, with growing clarity, that there would be no rescue, no regrouping. For 30,000 men, survival had ceased to be a matter of loyalty or glory. It had become a game of chance played against the sea, and the sea held every card. The second night. When the second night fell, the men realized the storm was not a passing fury but a siege. The sea was not merely angered, it was relentless, as though it meant to scrub them from memory. The rain had turned colder, stinging like thrown pebbles. Lanterns had long since drowned, and the ships moved in utter blackness. The only light came in brief flashes, jagged bolts of lightning tearing open the clouds, illuminating the chaos in stark silver before vanishing again. Each flash revealed wreckage, twisted spars drifting like skeletons, and men clinging to them, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent terror as thunder swallowed their cries. Food was already scarce. Salt pork had spoiled in wet barrels, bread had dissolved into mush. Men chewed leather straps to fool their stomachs. Others whispered prayers between vomiting fits, their bodies too weak to resist the rolling swells. Some swore they heard voices in the storm, familiar ones, mothers, brothers, wives calling from the waves. Desperation and exhaustion blurred the line between faith and madness. On one of the larger galleys, the captain gathered his men. His beard dripped with rain, his cloak plastered to his back, but his voice carried above the din. "Listen to me! Hold steady! This storm will pass, storms always do!" But his words rang hollow when a crack split the night. The mast above him, swollen with water, snapped in two and crashed across the deck. It crushed 3 men instantly. The captain stared in silence at their broken forms before forcing himself to shout again, though now even he did not believe. Elsewhere, soldiers quarreled. One group demanded the ship turn back toward land, though no one knew in which direction land lay. Another shouted that to turn was to betray the king's orders. Blades were drawn. Lightning illuminated their faces twisted in rage, but the argument ended when the sea itself decided. A towering wave struck the deck, washing half the men overboard in one sweep. In the blackness, their screams were brief. Then silence. That night stretched beyond time. Men clutched each other for warmth, teeth chattering, whispering of saints, of omens, of sins that had brought them to this punishment. Some swore it was the devil's hand upon the waves. Others believed the sea gods were claiming payment long overdue. And through it all, the storm showed no mercy. By dawn, if the pale gray haze could be called dawn, the men did not cheer to see another day. They only wondered which would be the last. Hunger and salt. By the third day, hunger gnawed sharper than fear. The storm had not ended, only softened into an endless churn. Gray skies pressed low, rain fell in sheets that blurred horizon from ocean, and the sea, though calmer than before, rolled with the weight of 1,000 dead ships. Barrels had burst. Bread, once hard enough to last weeks, had turned into sludge at the bottom of casks. Meat floated in brine and mold. Some soldiers scraped what they could, gagging as they swallowed. Others sucked on rope ends, their lips cracked and tongues swelling from thirst. For all the water around them, none could drink. It was salt, bitter and cruel, and each man who tried soon vomited until he collapsed. The men had begun whispering to one another, trading stories of what they'd seen in the storm. One swore he'd watched a galley vanish whole, dragged under by nothing visible. Another claimed to see ghostly figures walking on the waves, pointing, choosing which ships would die next. Whether true or madness, the tales spread, and with them, despair. On one battered cog, a soldier named Arnulf leaned over the rail, eyes hollow. "It would be quicker to let go," he muttered, his fingers trembling as they gripped the slick wood. His comrade clutched him by the collar. "Don't say it! Don't even think it!" But Arnulf only laughed bitterly, his ribs showing beneath his soaked tunic. "The sea has already chosen." Below deck, the smell was unbearable. Damp wood, vomit, unwashed bodies pressed together. Men lay in heaps, their skin clammy, their eyes glazed. Rats, bold in their hunger, darted among them, chewing at crumbs or gnawing cloth. Some men tried to catch them, desperate for meat. Above, the officers argued. They no longer spoke of orders or glory. Now they debated whether to turn back, though no one could say where back was. The storm had scattered the fleet beyond recognition. Signals were useless, and each ship that vanished left only the faintest echo of cries swallowed by surf. That night the rain stopped, but the silence it left was worse. The men sat in darkness, listening only to the creak of timbers and the lap of black water against the hull. Hunger hollowed them, thirst burned them, but it was the silence that made them tremble. For silence meant the sea was not finished. It was only waiting. The whispers of drowning men. By the seventh day, the fleet was no longer a fleet at all. It was a scattering of broken survivors, clinging to whatever timbers still floated. Some ships still carried their crews, but even those had begun to look less like armies and more like drifting tombs. On one galley, the rowers no longer had the strength to lift their oars. They sat slumped, chained to benches, their wrists raw, their eyes staring into nothing. The officer in charge, his armor rusted, his voice hoarse, shouted for them to row, but his words were swallowed in the heavy air. Finally, when he struck one across the back, the man toppled forward, face first into the bilge. No one moved to lift him. It was then that the whispers began. "They say the drowned come back," muttered a soldier, staring into the rolling gray sea. "Not whole, but in voices. Listen, listen close." And indeed, when the wind shifted, when the creak of the hull fell quiet, faint sounds drifted over the water. Groans, perhaps? A woman's cry. Laughter that seemed too far away to be real. Men pressed their ears to the rails, eyes wide, and swore they heard voices calling their names from beneath the waves. On another vessel, panic spread after a soldier, fevered and half-mad, pointed toward the black horizon. "There! Do you see them?" he shrieked. "The dead are walking! They're coming to take us all!" Men scrambled, tripping over ropes, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. Some swore they saw pale figures moving across the foam, drifting closer. Others laughed hysterically, as though madness itself had climbed aboard. The officers tried to contain it, barking orders, but even they were shaken. One knight, drenched and hollow-eyed, admitted under his breath, "I heard my mother's voice. She's been dead these 20 years." Fear became its own storm, heavier than wind or wave. Men accused one another of bringing curses aboard. A priest was dragged onto the deck and demanded to perform rites, though he had no altar, no chalice, only trembling hands. When he failed to calm them, the soldiers turned their suspicion on him too, whispering that perhaps he had angered God, that perhaps his prayers had cursed them instead of saved them. That night, men refused to sleep below deck. They huddled on the boards, watching the water as if it would rise and swallow them whole. The sea glimmered with eerie light, phosphorescence, though none knew the word for it, shining like green fire beneath the waves. To them, it looked like lanterns carried by the dead. And one by one, men began to vanish. Some slipped into the water, chasing voices that no one else could hear. Others, silent and resigned, stepped over the edge, their ripples the only sign they'd ever been there. By dawn, entire benches lay empty. The sea was taking them, if not by storm, then by madness. Hunger and the hollow bellies. By the 8th day, the sea had taken on a stillness that mocked the men who drifted upon it. No wind filled the sails. No fish leapt from the waves. Even the gulls, once circling with shrieks, had vanished as if they too sensed that nothing living should remain here. Food had run out 2 days prior. At first, men gnawed on strips of rope, hoping the salt and fibers would trick their stomachs into silence. Others tried to catch rainwater in helmets, but the skies, so violent before, now offered nothing but stubborn gray. Hunger did not stay polite for long. Whispers spread across the decks, low and dangerous, about men who had died in the storm and what became of their bodies. Some swore they'd seen shadows slip below deck carrying bundles, while others accused officers of hoarding provisions, though there were none to hoard. On one hulk of a galley, it happened openly. A corpse, swollen from seawater, was pulled onto the planks. For a moment the men simply stared, trembling, not with fear, but with yearning. Then, as though a spell had broken, knives were drawn. The first cut was hesitant, but hunger dulls horror. Within moments the silence was replaced by the sound of tearing flesh. When word spread to neighboring vessels, disgust battled temptation. "Their beasts," muttered one knight, spitting over the side. Yet his eyes lingered too long when the smell of cooking flesh drifted across the water. A smell that carried farther than the men hoped. Officers tried to enforce order. They lashed men caught in the act, declaring such things a sin blacker than the storm itself. But the lashings did little. Those who weren't punished simply grew more cunning, waiting until nightfall, when shadows covered their grim feast. One ship's priest, gaunt and wild-eyed, tried to end the whispers with a sermon. He stood barefoot on the deck, robes torn, arms raised to the sky. "Better we starve and meet God clean than feed like animals on our brothers." His words rang across the fleet, but so too did his collapse. He fell mid-sentence, his ribs sharp beneath his skin. By morning he was gone. Some swore his body vanished into the sea. Others said it never reached the water at all. By then, the fleet had grown quieter. Not from discipline, but from weakness. Men no longer argued. They lay in rows, eyes dull, too tired even to curse. They dreamed with their eyes half open, whispering names of wives, sons, and mothers who would never know how they died. The sea was merciless, and hunger had become its sharpest blade. Mirages on the waves. On the 9th day, the horizon began to play tricks. At first, a single ship cried out, "Land!" and half the crew lurched to their feet, eyes straining against the haze. There it was, or seemed to be, a dark green line, low and solid, rising from the shimmer of the sea. The men roared, voices cracking with hope, and some even tried to leap into the water, convinced they could swim to shore. But the green dissolved into mist. The horizon remained empty, only the endless swell of the gray-blue void. Still, once one man claimed to see salvation, others began to find it too. A sailor swore he saw a city of white marble towers glimmering upon the water, its gates wide open. Another described orchards heavy with fruit, the scent of figs drifting across the waves. A knight with lips so cracked they bled whispered that he heard bells tolling from a church, summoning him to mass. The vision spread like a fever. Crews turned against their officers, demanding they steer toward these phantom shores. When the rudder turned and nothing appeared, curses followed. "You blind us!" men shouted. "You keep us from salvation!" On one galley, a captain drew his sword to silence the frenzy, declaring, "There is nothing there! Nothing but sea! Yet as he spoke, his own men dragged him down, eyes blazing with madness. They tied him to the mast, not to kill him, but to prevent him from steering away from God's deliverance. The strangest mirages came at night. Some sailors swore they saw fleets of ships passing silently in the moonlight, sails full of wind, while theirs hung limp and lifeless. These ghost ships glided across the water, never acknowledging them, never stopping, vanishing as dawn broke. The most desperate clung to the thought that they had been abandoned by allies, that these were real ships unwilling to share provisions. Others knew better. These were not allies. They were phantoms. Priests tried to bless the hallucinations away, but their words carried little strength. Even holy men began to murmur of angels walking upon the waves, bearing loaves of bread. Some swore they tasted sweetness on their tongues when none had passed their lips. Yet for every man who dreamed, another fell into despair. By the time the 10th dawn rose, a few had chosen to slip quietly into the sea rather than endure another day of chasing illusions. The water closed over them without a ripple, as if the ocean had been waiting. The fleet was shrinking now, not by wreckage, but by surrender. The pestilence afloat. It began with a cough. At first, no one noticed. A sailor hacking over the side of the galley was hardly unusual. The salt air scraped throats raw, and men often spat to clear them. But by the next morning, that same sailor lay curled in the shadows, sweating through his tunic, lips cracked, eyes glassy. His mates tried to rouse him, but he only muttered nonsense, half prayers, half delirium. By noon, 3 more had fallen. The disease moved faster than the wind they prayed for. Men who were already weak from hunger had no strength to resist it. Some broke out in blotches across their skin, bruises that bloomed dark and angry. Others bled from their gums, spitting red into the sea. The decks reeked with sickness, sweet, foul, unmistakable. Whispers spread like the pestilence itself. Had they carried the Black Death with them from shore? Was God punishing them, sending his angel of death to finish what starvation had begun? Panic followed. Crews turned on one another, accusing strangers of bringing infection aboard. On one ship, a group of knights demanded the sick be cast into the waves, lest all perish. The captain hesitated only briefly. Men were dragged, pleading and sobbing, to the rails. Some clutched crucifixes, begging for mercy, but into the water they went, thrashing for a moment before the sea swallowed them whole. Yet tossing the sick overboard did not halt the rot. Each day brought more fevers, more bodies slumping against the bulwarks. The strongest tried to row, their arms trembling with weakness, but even the oars moved slower, dipping without rhythm. In the stillness of night, the sounds of the fleet changed. No longer the rhythmic creak of wood or the chant of rowers. Instead came the wet rattling of lungs, the murmured prayers of men too weak to rise, and the occasional splash when another body was lowered, or thrown, into the sea. Some ships tried to keep order with psalms, priests moving from man to man with whispered absolutions. Others turned savage, hoarding what little fresh water remained, guarding barrels with knives drawn. Unity dissolved. A fleet that had once seemed invincible was now a drifting cluster of plague ships, bound together by little more than despair. And still, the horizon stretched empty. No land, no sails, no salvation. Only death, wearing the faces of comrades. Storm without mercy. As if famine and pestilence were not enough, the heavens themselves rose against them. On the 12th night, the horizon blackened. A wall of cloud advanced, swallowing the stars. The air grew heavy, thick with the taste of iron, and then the sea began to rise, not in waves but in walls. Ships lurched like toys upon the swells, masts swaying against a sky torn with lightning. The first crack of thunder seemed to split the world in two. A galley, overloaded and half-rotted from neglect, snapped its mast clean away. The timber crashed through the deck, crushing 3 men beneath it. Screams echoed, cut short as the sea rushed in through the wound. Within minutes, the vessel was gone, its lantern vanishing beneath the foam. Elsewhere, sailors clung to oars that now served as their only anchors to life. The storm tore them from one another, scattering ships into the void. A captain tried to shout orders above the gale, but his voice was ripped away by the wind. Men rowed blindly, some against the waves, others with them, all at the mercy of forces beyond their reckoning. Salt water poured over the decks in torrents, washing the weak into the dark. Knights in heavy mail begged squires to cut away their armor lest it drag them down. Some succeeded, their breastplates clattering uselessly against the deck. Others sank without a sound, only the bubbles rising to mark where they had fallen. Lightning struck the sea itself, blinding and close. For an instant, the whole fleet was illuminated in ghostly light, galleys pitched nearly sideways, men hanging from rigging, horses screaming from the holds. Then darkness swallowed them again. One chronicler, if his words can be trusted, later wrote that the storm seemed almost sentient, hunting them. Whenever 2 ships tried to draw near, the waves rose higher, as though determined to separate brothers from brothers. By dawn, silence replaced the roar. The sea, exhausted, smoothed into a sullen calm. What remained of the fleet drifted apart, splintered, broken, reduced to fragments of what had been a force of pride and power. Where 30, 40, or 50 ships had once ridden together, now only a handful could glimpse one another's battered lanterns. The rest had been swallowed by the deep. Those who survived did not cheer their deliverance. They simply stared into the gray morning, hollow-eyed, as though already half buried in watery graves. And still, the coast of home lay far beyond sight. Hunger and betrayal at sea. The storm left more than wreckage in its wake. It stripped the men not only of their comrades, but of what little order had held the fleet together. Now, scattered across the channel, survivors faced the long dread of hunger and thirst. Barrels of water had been shattered, split open by the pitching of the ships. Bread soaked into the bilge and rotted in hours. Salt pork, which might have sustained them, was washed overboard. By the second day after the storm, lips cracked and tongues swelled. The sea itself stretched endlessly around them, cruel in its abundance yet poisonous to drink. Men whispered of relief, of finding a port, but no sails appeared on the horizon. Instead, despair turned inward. On one galley, a fight broke out over a single cask of rainwater caught during the storm. The captain ordered it rationed, but sailors, hollow-eyed and trembling, drew knives. Steel clashed in the dim morning light, and when it was over, 3 bodies floated in the waves, the barrel overturned, its contents lost to the ocean. Elsewhere, ships turned on one another. A surviving nightly transport, carrying cavalry, sighted a supply galley. Desperation outweighed honor. They lashed hooks to ropes and drew the smaller ship alongside. Men swarmed aboard with swords and axes, their pleas for water tangled with threats. The clash was brief and brutal. Those defending the galley were cut down, their stores claimed, but their attackers discovered too late that the provisions were already spoiled by salt water. The victors, exhausted, slumped in despair. Chroniclers hint, with hushed words, at darker deeds. On some ships, the weakest were said to vanish in the night. Sailors, too hollow to speak, turned their eyes from what happened in the shadows near the galley fire. In times of famine, even the unthinkable becomes whispered possibility. And yet, amid all this, there were moments of strange humanity. A squire on one crippled ship was seen handing his last crust to an older knight who had once beaten him bloody in training. Another group of sailors tied themselves together with rope, vowing that if the sea took one, it would take them all, so none should be left to drift alone. The fleet that had once launched in grandeur was no longer an army, nor even a collection of crews. It was now a scattering of desperate rafts, drifting between hope and hopelessness, each man caught between the will to survive and the slow erosion of that will. And the sea, patient as ever, waited for its due landfall in hostile shores. When land was finally sighted, it did not come with shouts of joy. Instead, it brought a silence so heavy that it seemed as though the men feared even to believe their own eyes. A dark, uneven line rose on the horizon, a ridge of cliffs mottled with green. To men who had seen nothing but grey water for days, it looked like salvation, yet to seasoned sailors, the shape of that coast was no blessing. It was Brittany. Or perhaps the Norman shore. Accounts differ, for by this point the fleet had drifted far from where it was meant to be. Wherever it was, one truth held: they were far from friendly waters. For many of the ships, England was the goal, and to land here was to step ashore in a land that might welcome them not with bread and water, but with steel. The choice was grim. Stay at sea and die of thirst, or risk landing where enemies might wait. Some ships turned their sails back toward the open water, refusing to gamble on unknown harbors. Others, too broken to continue, staggered toward the cliffs like dying beasts. Those who drew close found no gentle beaches, no wide harbors. The coastline was jagged, sharp with rocks. Ships were dashed against stone before they could even drop anchor. Men leapt into the surf, swimming through foam with bleeding hands and gasping lungs. Some reached the shallows, only to collapse on the sand, too weak to crawl farther. Others never surfaced again, their armor dragging them beneath the tide. For those who did reach land, danger followed swiftly. Local villagers, seeing strange men staggering from the sea, raised alarms. To them, these were not desperate survivors but invaders. Armed bands soon gathered along the ridges, crossbows cocked and spears gleaming. Exhausted and unarmed, the shipwrecked knights and sailors had no fight left in them. Many were cut down where they lay. Others were bound and dragged into villages, prisoners of men who had no interest in mercy. Some chroniclers write that a handful of survivors, too weak even to resist, were offered bread and water by local priests who pitied them. But these small acts of kindness were swallowed by the wider tale of slaughter. In the villages, the sea's gift was met not with compassion, but suspicion. And so men who had survived the storm, the hunger, and the betrayal of comrades found themselves undone by the hands of strangers on solid ground. The sea had released them, but only into the arms of another form of ruin. Whispers across Christendom. News of the disaster did not rush across Europe like a trumpet call. It seeped, slow and uneven, like rainwater trickling through cracked stone. A fisherman, returning to harbor, told of wreckage washed ashore. A Breton shepherd swore he had seen armored corpses carried in by the tide, their faces still hidden behind rusted visors. A monk in Normandy wrote in his annals of ships that came no more, though he did not know their number. From such fragments rumor grew. In England, whispers began that the fleet had been cursed. Some said the storm was God's judgment on proud kings who sought dominion of the seas, a punishment for vanity and bloodshed. Others whispered that sorcery had played its part, that an enemy had called the winds with charms, and drowned men by the thousands with a gesture. Numbers, as always in medieval tales, swelled with each retelling. What had begun as reports of a handful of ships lost became dozens, then hundreds. Some claimed 30,000 men had vanished into the waves in a single night. Others said more, 40, even 50,000. In truth, no one knew. For the sea is not an accountant. It does not tally its victims neatly. It swallows whole, and the silence left behind is the only ledger. In taverns, sailors muttered over mugs of ale that the North Sea had grown hungry, and that to cross it now was to gamble with death. Priests used the tale in sermons, warning congregations of the fleetingness of life, of how even the mightiest fleet could be undone by one storm, one night, one gust of wind. And yet, for all the horror, the story carried a strange pull. Men leaned closer to hear it retold by firelight, shivering as though the salt spray still clung to their skin. The silence of those vanished ships became louder than the roar of their cannons had ever been. The vanished fleet was not only a tragedy, it became a legend. And legends, once set loose, travel farther than ships ever can. Kings, chroniclers, and the politics of silence. In the courts of Europe, the disaster was not spoken of as plainly as it was in taverns or cloisters. Rulers knew the weight of words. To admit that thousands had drowned, that fleets had been swallowed without trace, was to confess weakness, not only before enemies, but before their own people. So the silence that followed the storm was not only natural, it was deliberate. Letters between nobles spoke vaguely of ships delayed, or men lost to misfortune. Chronicles, those careful ledgers of kings and battles, recorded only fragments, sometimes a single sentence to stand in for a catastrophe. A great number of vessels perished in the sea. One monk scrawled in his yearbook, then moved on to an eclipse. But silence, too, has its politics. Enemies of the crown seized upon rumors to tarnish reputations. Behold, some said, the king who cannot even keep his men safe at sea. Others suggested divine disfavor, pointing to the drowned as proof that God withheld his blessing. Rivals, poets, and preachers alike shaped the storm into an omen, one convenient for their own purposes. Chroniclers, always half-storytellers, embroidered where the facts were absent. A Norman scribe claimed to have seen the wrecks himself. Like bones scattered upon the sand, shields gleaming like fish scales in the dawn. Another wrote of phantom ships that appeared off the coast in the years after, sails black and crewless, doomed to wander until Judgment Day. Meanwhile, kings and their ministers faced practical despair. Whole families had been stripped of sons, fathers, and brothers. Mercenaries, who might have tipped a campaign in their favor, were gone. Supplies, costly to gather and ship, lay rotting in the seabed. A year's planning, perhaps more, had vanished overnight. Yet to acknowledge such a loss was to open oneself to rebellion, or at least to ridicule. And so, the rulers spoke of future campaigns, of God's timing, of fortunes yet to come. Their subjects, less blinded by politics, muttered instead of hungry mouths and empty hearths. What was clear to all, whether admitted or not, was this: a storm had done what no army could. Widows by the shore. When the sea calmed and the sky brightened, life on land had to resume, though it carried with it a new heaviness. Along the coasts where ships had last been sighted, women walked the tidal, searching for anything that might connect them to their husbands, brothers, or sons. A splinter of wood, a torn boot, a coin with a familiar scratch, these pitiful relics became their memorials. The widows wore black, though often they had no body to bury. Churches held requiem masses for the souls lost in the storm. But the absence of graves made mourning strangely unmoored. Some villagers piled stones on the cliff edges, makeshift cairns facing the waters. Others tied bits of cloth to driftwood crosses and planted them in sand, hoping the wind might carry the prayers out to sea. Children, too young to fully understand, grew up on lullabies sung not for sleep but for remembrance. A boy would ask, "When will father's ship come back?" and receive no answer. A girl, helping her mother mend nets, might hear only silence where once there had been laughter in the evenings. The storm had turned fishermen's cottages into houses of echoes. Markets faltered. Men who had worked as sailors, carpenters, or porters on naval expeditions were gone, and their absence rippled through the towns. Ships sat unfinished in dry docks. Warehouses stood half empty. Even the taverns grew quieter, the clamor of men's voices replaced by whispers and grief. And yet the sea did not relent. Nets still had to be cast, boats still rowed. Some widows took up their husbands' oars, rowing out with calloused hands, their faces set like stone against the waves. Others remarried quickly, necessity pushing them into new unions, though the old losses never faded. The clergy urged people to accept the storm as God's will. But among the common folk, murmurings grew darker. Some muttered that the sea was cursed. Others whispered of sorcery, that an enemy king had called the storm with prayers or charms. A few even said it was no storm at all, but that the men had been swallowed by the sea because of sins too great to name. Life trudged on, but beneath every chore, every prayer, every market cry, lay the same unspoken truth: the sea had taken more than ships. It had taken the future those men would have built. Ghost ships on the horizon. With so many lives lost in a single night, it was inevitable that stories would sprout like weeds after rain. The sea does not keep secrets, the sailors said, it whispers them back in strange ways. And so, in the months and years after the disaster, villagers along the coast began to speak of phantom sails. Fishermen swore they had seen outlines of galleys drifting in the mist, their oars rising and falling without sound. Some claimed they heard drums beating across the waves, though no living fleet was near. Others told of lanterns bobbing on the horizon, lights that never drew closer and never faded, as though the dead were holding an eternal watch. These visions carried both comfort and dread. For the widows and orphans, the ghost ships meant their men were not wholly gone, that they still sailed somewhere between this world and the next. But for superstitious sailors, the sightings were omens. To see the phantom fleet was to court your own doom, a reminder that the sea demanded offerings of blood and bone. Monks recorded strange happenings too. In Abbey chronicles there are lines about a great host of souls seen over the waters, chanting psalms not of this earth. Pilgrims passing along the coast claimed that when the wind was right, one could hear not just the howling of the gale but the voices of thousands crying out, as if drowning again and again. Children grew up hearing these stories as bedtime warnings. Behave, or the drowned sailors will take you to row in their ship of shadows. Markets saw trinkets sold as charms against the phantom fleet, bits of coral carved into crosses, tiny bells said to drive away the drowned. The fear became woven into daily life, just as much as salt and bread. And always the sea remained the same. Calm one day, furious the next, uncaring of prayers or legends. The ghost ships, whether real or imagined, became a way for the living to explain the unexplainable. Because no matter how many tales were told, the fact lingered like a wound: 30,000 men had gone to sea, and the sea had kept them. Thrones left trembling. While villagers spoke in hushed tones of ghost fleets and restless souls, kings and princes faced a different reckoning. Naval disasters of such scale were not just tragedies, they were political earthquakes. Armies vanished overnight, coffers were drained, and ambitions that had stretched across horizons suddenly shrank like sails in a dead wind. In the courts of Europe, the news was received with disbelief. Messengers staggered ashore days after the storm, bedraggled and wild-eyed, carrying accounts so grim that many rulers accused them of lies. "It is not possible," one king declared, slamming his fist against the table, "that a fleet so mighty could be erased by a single night." Yet it was true. No sword had been raised, no enemy banner flown, only the sea had triumphed. The consequences rippled outward. Wars ground to halts as armies found themselves bereft of reinforcements. Mercenary contracts were broken. Alliances wavered, for what good was a kingdom's promise if its fleet now lay rotting on the seabed? Treasuries were emptied to replace lost ships, but the cost of timber, rope, and iron skyrocketed, and many nobles grew restless under the strain of new taxes. For the widows and children left behind, promises of royal aid came slowly, if at all. Compensation was whispered but rarely delivered. Some rulers preferred to erase the memory of disaster, treating it as shame rather than sorrow. Chroniclers were commanded to downplay the numbers, to record a loss of ships rather than tens of thousands of lives. Yet the common folk knew better. Every empty bed in every fishing town told the truth. In council chambers, the disasters became lessons carved in water. Commanders swore they would never again risk so many lives in one venture. Naval architects were ordered to design sturdier vessels, but superstition weighed just as heavily as science. Some demanded ships be blessed twice before sailing. Others decreed that certain days of the calendar, those tied to the memory of the great storm, should forever be avoided for launching fleets. Yet ambition has its own tides. Within a decade, kings who had sworn humility before the waves once more dreamt of conquest. Ships were built, men conscripted, banners raised. The disasters, though vast, became memories dulled by time, remembered most keenly only by those who had buried sons and brothers. The thrones trembled but did not topple. Instead, they leaned forward once again, gazing out over the gray horizon, daring the sea to try its hand again. Voices that returned from the deep. Not all were lost. A scattered handful, men clinging to broken timbers, or washed ashore days later with their clothes stiffened by salt, survived to bear witness. Their voices, ragged and haunted, carried the weight of 30,000 silenced companions. One such survivor, a young archer, was found by shepherds on a lonely beach, his lips cracked, his eyes hollow. When they asked what had happened, he whispered only, "The sea was louder than war." Another man staggered into a monastery, delirious, raving that he had seen phantom lights beneath the waves, torches carried by drowned soldiers marching forever on the ocean floor. These testimonies spread like wildfire. Villagers leaned in around tavern tables, repeating the fragments until they grew into legend. Some claimed the men had seen Saint Nicholas himself, walking upon the storm to gather the faithful into heaven. Others swore the survivors spoke of sea demons, great black shapes that dragged whole ships beneath with invisible hands. Whether truth or dream, the stories ensured that the disaster lived on not as a mere storm, but as a supernatural reckoning. Among sailors, the survivors became reluctant prophets. Men pressed them for details. What signs had appeared in the sky before the gale? What omens had been missed? Did gulls vanish? Did the sea smell of iron? Every word became a charm, a warning, a spell to be memorized. Many captains refused to embark without consulting such witnesses, as though their scarred memories contained secret maps of fate. But the survivors themselves carried burdens no tale could ease. They returned to villages where wives and children had perished waiting, where whole communities were emptied of men. Survivors' guilt festered quietly. Some turned hermit, refusing ever again to look upon the sea. Others sought solace in monasteries, trading sails for silence. A few drank themselves into oblivion, haunted by the memory of drowning voices calling their names through the storm. And yet, their words lingered in the chronicles of monks, in the gossip of markets, in the quiet bedtime warnings of mothers to their children. They became threads woven into the wider tapestry of medieval memory, evidence that the sea was not just water, but a living power, merciless and eternal. The vanished fleet was gone. But through the broken voices of those who stumbled back, its shadow remained, thick with grief, thick with fear, a reminder that no empire, no army, no king, could command the ocean. The echo that never faded. Centuries passed, yet the night when 30,000 men vanished at sea never truly sank into silence. Chronicles inked by monks in quiet cloisters retold it with trembling pens, merchants whispered of it in distant ports, and ballads wove fragments of it into mournful songs that mothers hummed to restless children. The ships themselves rotted away beneath the waves, their timbers feasted upon by worms and barnacles, yet the memory of their crews drifted ashore with every generation. For the medieval world, such calamities were never viewed as accidents alone. The sea was a mirror of divine will, and when it rose in fury, it was read as punishment, omen, or judgment. Entire coastal villages adopted new rituals, candles lit before voyages, offerings cast into the tide, long pauses of silence before a ship's maiden departure. Even in inland towns, far from the smell of brine, the story carried weight, proof that the mightiest kings and their grandest fleets were as fragile as driftwood in the face of nature's rage. The vanished soldiers became spectral presences. Sailors swore they heard marching beneath the waves, a muffled thunder that followed their hulls on calm nights. Fishermen told of nets tangled with rusted armor, bones that glittered like ivory in the deep. Theologians debated whether so many souls had been swept instantly into heaven, or if they wandered the sea still, caught between worlds. Yet out of the sorrow came something quieter, gentler. Communities shattered by the loss planted crosses by the shore, not only for the men they knew, but for all the nameless dead. Pilgrims began walking to these windswept markers, kneeling in prayer for strangers. What had begun as a tragedy became, in time, a reminder of shared humanity, that the sea could take any man, rich or poor, knight or peasant, and in its taking, it made equals of them all. The lesson endured: the ocean does not bargain. It does not bow to crowns or swords. Empires crumble, rulers fade, but the tide moves forever, steady and indifferent. And so, the story of the 30,000 vanished men was told not simply as disaster, but as parable, a whisper to those who followed: remember humility, for the sea remembers all. And when later sailors raised their sails at dusk, they sometimes thought they glimpsed lights moving far off the coast, torches, they said, held by ghostly watchmen still standing guard, waiting for ships that would never return.